So, hey, I'm here with Ryan. We're going to continue our discussion on an article entitled Jesus on Every Page, written by David Murray. These are 7 reasons to study your Old Testament. The first one was that the Old Testament reveals Christ, both through pictures, types, but also foretelling his coming. Secondly, the Old Testament is a dictionary of Christian vocabulary, ideas of redemption, salvation, the meaning of what a Messiah is. All these central Christian terms are really enriched by seeing them through the lens of the Old Testament. Thirdly, the Old Testament is a manual for Christian living. There are some good moral principles, examples to follow, examples not to follow in the Old Testament. Fourthly, the Old Testament presents doctrine in story form. Man, Brother Ryan had some incredible comments on that. Now, fifthly, this is interesting. We talked a little bit about this. The Old Testament comforts and encourages us. As we read the Old Testament narratives, we experience the beautiful comfort and hope that would accompany such a study. You spoke a little bit pointing to that through the idea of narrative. Do you have any more comments on that?
What keeps coming to mind is, personally in my own study, I'm going through the book of Psalms, right? And it is innumerable. We look at Psalms, Proverbs, and we look at the little nuggets that we can pull from it. And obviously, everything points back to security and comfort in Christ. And in the Old Testament, with the coming Messiah, and we talked a little bit about that. But when we look at these truths that we pull out of Psalms, and we look at the provision of God, even before Psalm, even before poetry, and we look at the narrative of Exodus, we look at the narrative of the Jews coming out of Israel, being rescued out of Egypt. We look at God giving them security, giving them comfort and hope and peace, and never leaving them. What really kind of gives me peace in this is God is our Father, and how He fathered the nation of Israel.
That's so
and what
good,
are the characteristics of that of a father? A father is loving, he's caring, he cares for his people, he desires the best for his people, as does any father. So when we look at God fathering the nation of Israel, not just does he give comfort to David in times of grief and times of trouble, and we see David pouring his heart out to God in Psalm 51, but we also look at God leading the people of Israel by a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. That is God's actual pragmatic pouring out of himself to his people.
Is it fair to say, likewise, that God fathers his church?
Absolutely.
In our day?
Yeah. And we don't lose that. That's a beautiful thing. We don't lose that in this dispensation, that Christ desires and loves his church just as he loved Israel. Just as he loved, present tense, just as he loves Israel.
Loves Israel,
just as he cares for Israel and desires for Israel, he desires for his church, he desires for his people.
So there's a word we haven't mentioned, and that's the idea of a remnant.
Can you talk into that a little bit?
Yeah, so there's an idea throughout, all of Scripture, that God always has a people set apart unto himself. So even in the midst of Israel's idolatry, pursuing pagan religions, intermarrying with pagan nations, going away from God's law, rejecting him, even in that there is a remnant, sometimes very few people that were true to God and were his people in the sense of them being in obedience to him. And so in our day, we might look at the church and say, man, it looks just like the world. It's very pagan. What happened to being wholly set apart unto God? You know, that part of salvation we call sanctification.
Right.
Being set apart in holiness to God. But there is always going to be a remnant, even though it may be small, that's set unto God.
Absolutely.
Now, this one's crazy, bro. This one twisted my brain a bit. The Old Testament saves souls. Now, let me read this. Okay. This is a short paragraph.
Please.
The Apostle Paul had the highest regard for the Old Testament's origin, nature, power, and purpose. In fact, in 2 Timothy 3:16, what did he say? All Scripture, right? Or no, that's another one. He said the Holy Scriptures were able to make someone wise unto salvation. And he was speaking of the Scriptures that Timothy were taught being raised up, which
Right.
were Old Testament scriptures. So when we take a holistic view, man, we can understand God as a father,
Yeah.
God's redemptive plan through mankind, the Old Testament pointing to Christ. So Paul would argue a lot and strongly here, pointedly here, that the Old Testament can save one's can enlighten one unto salvation.
Absolutely.
Make one wise unto salvation.
You look at the prophets. I mean, the prophets were consistently, and again, we're going back to this idea.
Let me interject. Through faith in the Messiah, who is Jesus Christ.
Right.
We're not talking about Old Testament law.
No, absolutely. And again, the Old Testament prophets were constantly pointing to the fulfillment of the Messiah who would fulfill the prophecy and not abolishing the law, but rather to fulfill the law. That idea of fulfillment was still seen in the Old Testament. I mean, they knew that the law was not, it wasn't substantive for their salvation. So I mean, just looking at that idea of the Old Testament constantly pointing to the Messiah, it's constantly pointing to this redemptive power. I think you could easily read the Old Testament and see salvation. That there is hope. There is hope.
So for clarity, I'm going to ask this question: Can you share the gospel through Old Testament narrative, scripture, story?
Absolutely,
you can.
I think
Isn't that cool?
Yeah, you look at Genesis, right? You look at the God's original intention for humanity is that we would live in paradise, that God would bless us, that we would commune and fellowship within the Trinity in perfection and in holiness. And that was destroyed. That was ruined by sin. Even throughout the entire Old Testament, God's desire for his people was restoration within and of himself.
Good, man.
That's before we even get to the cross. That's before we even get to Christ. And the beauty of all that is that the cross is the cap of all that. The cross is what tops it all off. And then we have the entirety of church history where we see God pursuing his church.
That's good stuff. So the Old Testament, is a great platform to preach and teach.
So I would encourage anybody to, next time you share the gospel with someone who doesn't know Christ, stick in the Old Testament, and then when you get to Christ, when you get to the cross, there's so much heavier of a period, I would say, on that.
So this seventh point is going to illustrate all that we've talked about and said. The Old Testament makes you appreciate the New Testament more.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, without the Old Testament, we miss all of what we just talked about. This huge context of, man, the unbelievable blessing, human history-changing event in the life, the work, the crucifixion, death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ.
When you read the suffering servant, when you read that passage in Psalms that talks about how Christ is going to be crucified almost 1,000 years before crucifixion was even thought of, it makes you appreciate when you turn to the end of the Gospels and you begin to read this moment in history that will mark all of humanity. I mean, I think it brings so much more of a perspective into
Isn't that cool?
Yeah. Well, Ricky, I really appreciate you inviting me, and we're able to talk about this and reflect on the Old Testament, and I don't know what else to say.
That's good, man. That's good. So I would say let's open the Bible to the Old Testament, begin reading. Let's begin drawing comfort from those narratives, noticing the types and pictures and foretelling of Jesus, recognizing those prophecies, understanding the context of what it really meant for Israel to see the coming Messiah. I mean, let's get into it and discover.
Absolutely.
Let's discover God's goodness in His Word.
Very cool.
Man, we'll talk to you again soon.